This is the first of a 3-lecture series, and the 3-lecture series is in turn a sketch of about half of a book on this topic that I just finished a draft of last week, much to the joy of my editor at Yale. And this lecture deals specifically with the United States. The second lecture broadens the empirical frame out to address European developments and, in general, Western developments. And the third lecture builds on the empirical foundation laid in the first 2 lectures to offer some theoretical reflections on what the significance of these changes might be and what kind of conceptual political theory framework might be useful for understanding them. So the real gluttons for punishment are going to get the whole thing, but I hope this first lecture will be reasonably self-contained. It is a long lecture as written out. I will not inflict the full thing on you, but offer a kind of summary, which I hope I can get through reasonably briskly, because my commentator, Lynn Sanders, I know has worked very hard on her commentary, and I don't want her to have to cut it short. But mostly, I would like a lot of time available for the part of the event in which I learned the most, namely the questions and answers, the dialogue. It took me many decades to learn that I learned more when I wasn't talking than when I was. It seems like a very simple insight, but it took me some time. So let me tee this up by posing a possibility, and it's no more than that. And the possibility is that we are now living at one of these hinge moments in history where the framework of understanding that we've taken for granted ceases to apply. And it's necessary to step back and rethink what we thought we knew. Is this such a moment? The honest answer is, I don't know, and nobody else does either. Okay? Is this the equivalent of a passing storm? Or is it a beginning of some tectonic change where the plates have released after having been locked for a very long time? A great deal of energy is being released, and the landscape will not look the same once the plates settle down to a new temporary equilibrium. Now, I've tried to figure out what the implications are of the possibility that this might be a hinge moment, a moment in which we re-examine what we thought we knew and we struggle to understand anew. It's a period in which I think we need to do 2 things. First of all, we need to interrogate all of our assumptions. It's not a question of suspending disbelief, it's a question of suspending belief, which is much harder. And secondly, and this goes against the grain somewhat, but only somewhat, of the marvelous institution that's sponsoring this series, we have to be as ruthlessly empirical in a very basic sense as we possibly can be. We have to reach as widely as we can for evidence that might help us to understand this moment. And to the maximum extent possible, we have to let it speak for itself and learn from it rather than imposing ourselves on it. And there are all sorts of epistemological standpoints from which what I've just recommended is impossible. I'm aware of all of those debates, and for all I know, the people who take the opposite side of what I just said are correct. But as a heuristic, anyway, I think it's really important to open ourselves to the widest range of evidence, which is what I'm trying to do in these lectures. And let me give you an example from my own case. We all bring priors to the task of understanding events. And 4 years ago, when I began writing about what I saw as a rising populist tide, I was convinced that it was principally, if not exclusively, an economic phenomenon, rooted in a shift in market economies as profound as the shift from agriculture to industry at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. And that is certainly part of the story. But mounting evidence has persuaded me that it is only a part of the story, and that the sorts of issues that the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture studies for a living, having to do with identity and cultural self-understanding, are also a big part of the story. I mean, 4 years ago, I was telling my friends that I had become a kind of quasi-Marxist, where I'm taking very seriously the old-fashioned Marxist base superstructure distinction, where economic change was driving everything. And there are limited areas in which I think that is defensible, but the phenomena that I'm going to be talking about tonight, tomorrow night, and Wednesday night are not so simply grasped. So, where to begin in my take on the United States and its current situation? Well, I'm going to begin with Brexit. I, like many other political scientists, was fascinated with the whole Brexit debate and the Brexit vote. I stayed up very, very late watching the BBC as the amazing returns rolled in last June. And after about 3 hours, a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, my God, with the change of a few proper nouns and, of course, accents, they could be talking about the U.S. election. And it was that experience that began to reframe my understanding of what was going on in my own country. Now, if you look at the principal drivers of the Brexit vote, the things about people that really shaped how they voted, the single most important by a considerable margin is the level of education people had. Not the level of income, but the level of education. Income isn't irrelevant, but what is much more fundamental is education, and in particular, significant amounts of post-secondary education. Education, it turns out, not only gives you a capacity to earn more in today's economy, if you choose to go down that road, but more significantly, it tends to shape your outlook. The more educated you are, the more comfortable you are with change, the more comfortable you are with diversity, the more confident you are about the future, and the more control you think you have over that future. So, and I have taken this insight about higher education, and I've sort of wandered around the democratic world looking at it. I looked for evidence of this, for example, in Israeli politics, and I found it, and it wasn't hard to find once you knew what you were looking for. And I think in some ways education has emerged as the most fundamental divide in the populations and electorates of Western democracies. But more than that, in the Brexit vote, as I mentioned, income is significant. Age is significant. All things equal in England, the older you are, the more likely you are to have supported the vote to leave the EU. Place matters a lot. One of the one of the major economic and social developments of the past generation is the growing bifurcation of fortune between large urban centers on the one hand and peripheries on the other. And this is true across the advanced industrialized world, particularly since the beginning of the third millennium. The big cities have leapt ahead economically, and the rural areas and small towns have fallen behind. And as you'll see in the United States, that is demonstrably and I think dangerously true. Interestingly, if you look at age, there's a big difference between the UK and the US on the one hand and Western Europe on the other. In Western Europe, young people are highly disaffected from the established order, much more so than here. And although I haven't been able to find an exit poll on the French election that transpired just yesterday, I will bet that it will show that the three insurgent candidates of the National Front, of Macron and of Mélenchon, will have received 90% of the young adult vote, or pretty close, and the established parties, the center-left and center-right parties, will have received almost none of it. And the reason for that, looking forward, is that in Europe, institutional arrangements, particularly in the labor market, have kept an enormous share of young adults out of the stable long-term employment market altogether. Not so in the United States, not so to the same extent. There are many European countries where the rate of young adult unemployment is 25%. And I'm not talking about 18 to 21-year-olds. I'm talking about people in their 20s up to the age of 30. In some countries, it's much higher than that. During the worst of the economic crisis in Spain and in Italy, it was about 50%. And an entire generation of young adults feels that it is losing any hope of a future. It's not true to the same extent in the UK and the US. Other things that matter, the economic sector that you're from, all other things equal. If you're in the manufacturing sector or routine automatable services, in the UK, you were not feeling very good about life, and you tended to blame existing arrangements, of which membership in the EU was one, for that. And also, no surprise based on what I've just said, optimism. Right? The more optimistic you were about the future in the UK, the more likely you were to support remaining in the EU. The more pessimistic, the more likely you were to support leaving. Okay, I've teed up the Brexit vote because, as I suggested at the outset, the structural similarities between that vote and recent political events in the United States are really quite striking. As James indicated in his opening remarks, I divide my analysis into a familiar triad of the economy, the society, and the polity and the politics thereof. A few economic facts. I have a much longer analysis in my written remarks, but I'm not going to go there right now. Probably some of you know that a crucial statistic, that is median household income, the income received by the household right in the middle of the distribution, with as many receiving less as more, that median household income peaked in 1999 and has not regained its 1999 peak in the 18 years since. Not only that, what economic gain there has been very unevenly divided. Incomes and employment have risen handsomely in the urban centers, and both income and employment have declined quite significantly in the peripheral areas. Even more important than levels of income at any snapshot point in time is the issue of social mobility, which, if the American dream has a core, it's the idea of mobility. And here is an astounding statistic from recent research by Raj Chetty and colleagues. 90% of those born in 1940 ended up outperforming their parents economically. Less than 50% of children born in the 1980s can say the same thing. So mobility, defined very crudely as doing better than your parents, has been cut in half in the decades between the birth cohort of 1940 and the birth cohort of the 1980s. Another feature of the American dream is optimism about the future. And not surprisingly, as mobility has declined, optimism about the future has as well. Only 32% of adult Americans now express optimism that the next generation will do better than they themselves are now doing. And as I've just indicated, they themselves, this generation of adults, is not doing so great, but they expect things to be worse for the next generation. On the societal front, and here I rest my case on some recent research that a bipartisan consortium of people interested in survey research has just conducted. The actual report hasn't come out yet, but I'm going to give you a sneak preview. On the societal front, the dominant phenomenon shaping American politics is immigration. And it is no accident, comrades, that so much of Donald Trump's presidential campaign revolved around the issue of immigration. And immigration itself raises three issues for people who are troubled by it. First, on the economic front, there is the fear that immigrants, particularly lower-skill immigrants, are competing for lower-skill jobs, driving down wages and employment opportunities for native-born Americans. There's also the sense that lower-skilled immigrants, who have dominated the flow of immigration now for a generation, are more likely, at least in their first years in this country, to demand a high level of social services, which will require higher levels of taxation, particularly on the local and state level, and which will set up a competition between native-born Americans and lower-skill immigrants for social services. The second issue that immigration raises is demographic. And here a little bit of history will serve. In the surge of immigration in the latter decades of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, ending in 1920, first-generation immigrants as a share of the population rose to 15% at the peak. And I think, not surprisingly, this surge of immigrants and their visibly increasing share of the population had the effect of triggering nativist fears, a nativist reaction, that it expressed itself in legislation, starting in the early 1920s, culminating in the 1924 immigration law, which for all practical purposes slammed shut the immigration gates to the United States for more than 4 decades. During that period, first-generation immigrants as a share of the population fell from 15% to 4.7%. That's where they were in 1964. In 1965, in a law whose consequences for American society was just as momentous as the Voting Rights Act, the Hart-Celler Bill, which some of you may be old enough to remember, reopened the immigration gates, and not only that, eliminated the sorts of regional restrictions that had tended to channel immigrant flows to people from Europe. And so you started to see unprecedented flows of people from our hemisphere and also from Asia. After 6 decades, this law has transformed America's demography. If we slammed the gates shut again tomorrow, within the lifetime of many people in this room, we would be a majority-minority country. Some people are thrilled by this development. Others are less thrilled. They see it as a threat. They see it as a source of displacement. Right? It is our country, or it was our country, they say, but it isn't any longer. People who haven't been here as long as we are shouldering us aside. And so there's a fear of immigrants who don't do well, and perhaps even a greater fear of immigrants who do well, as many do. And then, as the third leg of these anti-immigration fears, there's the security dimension. Domestically, crime, and also terrorism. And we can have a long discussion about this, but those fears are there. They're real. They're not going away. And and however much social scientists say that the principal difficulty is not with people coming into the country and committing mayhem, but people who are already here and who are self-radicalizing in one way or another, that message, I think, is not getting through. It faces an almost impermeable screen of assumptions about what is going on. So that's the economy and the society. As for politics, I think this is a familiar story, and I'm not going to dwell on it too extensively. There has been, in the past 2 generations, an astonishing rise in not only the scope but the depth of partisan polarization. You have lots and lots of people now saying that the other party isn't just wrong, and it isn't just that I disagree with the policies they're going to pursue, but the other party's agenda makes me afraid. And even more, it makes me angry. And to a greater extent that I think I've seen in decades, the dominant political sentiment of our age, I believe, is anger. Not just anxiety, although there's lots of that, but actual, pervasive, palpable anger. The partisanship, or hyperpartisanship, is itself linked with a phenomenon that you're all aware of, namely partisan polarization, which is particularly troubling in the U.S. constitutional system, a system that allows for divided partisan control of different institutions. If you have a government that is divided between the 2 political parties, what you get is gridlock. When gridlock gives way to unified government, as it has 3 times now since the beginning of the 3rd millennium, it tends to lead to partisan overreach, where a political party that is temporarily in control of things says, we can now do what we wanted. We do not need to consult the other political party. They are misguided, and worse than that, they're threats to the republic. Why should we pay any attention to what they have to say? And the partisan overreach then cycles back into an even higher level of partisan of partisan anger. As we're now learning, there's a third possibility, and that is that even when there's unified government, that the divisions within the majority party are so deep as to make action very, 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 very difficult. And we will see over the next 18 months or now whether this is a remediable situation for the Republican Party or whether we're talking about something that's deep and structural. I could argue it either way. Will the instinct for partisan self-preservation trump, if I'm allowed to use that verb, the enormous divisions that the expanded Republican majority now contains, or will the divisions trump the need to accomplish things in order to survive politically? Partisan polarization and the long episodes of gridlock to which partisan polarization has given rise during the past generation is experienced by people who want change as deeply frustrating. And that frustration, and this is where you begin to verge on problems at the institutional and the regime level. The frustration at the incapacity of established institutions and leaders to act effectively on the people's behalf has given rise to a pervasive willingness to break the rules, if that's what's necessary. In the fall of 2016, a survey in which I was involved found that 49% of the electorate agreed with the proposition that, quote, because things have gotten so far off track in this country, we need a leader who is willing to break some rules to set things right. 49% of the electorate as a whole, 57% of Republicans, 60% of white working class voters, 72% of Mr. Trump's supporters. And this, it seems to me, is at the core of the populist response to the problems that I've enumerated. Many people, it seems to me, are responding to the policy failures, the political failures, but also, and I think we all need to take this seriously, the meritocratic snobbery of elites. I have done a lot of thinking about the phrase flyover country. Some of you may have heard. Okay, and the phrase flyover country encapsulates a worldview that in happier times was captured in a New Yorker cover by Saul Steinberg, if you remember that, where you have New York, New Jersey, cactus, and then California. And a lot of what we've seen in the past 2 years is a sense not only of policy concerns that are being overlooked, of voices in the society who are not being heard, but a perception of a fundamental lack of respect of leaders in both political parties for the people that they are elected and sworn to serve. It doesn't help that the best and the brightest have managed to preside over a series of policy failures, which is not to say that American governance in the past 6 decades has been a failure. I don't believe that. But if people set themselves up as the experts and then things go badly wrong on their watch, that has profound consequences, it seems to me, for the institutions and the politics of that country. And as a number of surveys have documented, including, I've just learned, a survey that the Institute conducted last summer, this decline of trust and confidence in national governmental institutions and a darkened view of the motives of elected officials helps, I think, to contextualize the current populist moment. I think you're all aware of some of the basics here. Trust in governmental institutions is at rock bottom levels, and interestingly, it's not just governmental institutions. A Gallup survey that came out just a few weeks ago found that with the exception of small business and the military, every single institution in American society, public, private, or voluntary, is held in lower regard today than a generation ago. Every single one. So it's a withdrawal of trust and confidence on a very wide front. The sense that leaders are acting in the interests of the people has declined enormously. And the sense that the country is on the right track is conspicuous by its absence. The last time people thought that the United States was on the right track, all things considered, was 13 years ago in the year 2004. In the history of survey research going back now nearly 80 years, there is no parallel. There's no other instance of such long-standing pessimism about the fundamental trajectory of the country. And I think all the leaders of the country and all the analysts of the country have to ask themselves deeper questions than they have up to now about what that might mean for the future of our democracy. But now let me reach my bottom line. Is American democracy itself in danger? My answer to that question is a qualified no. I don't think it is. And I have a number of reasons for saying that, and then some tests for determining whether we can cross a line at which it would be in danger. First of all, I think it's important to distinguish between policy failures on the one hand and and actual threats to democracy on the other. And I'm sure there are many people in this room who think that the policy preferences and policy orientation of the current administration are fundamentally flawed. But there's a difference between policies that one regards as heinous on the one hand and attacks on basic institutions on the other. So I think we have to be very, 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 very discriminating. Not every big policy disagreement warrants, a trumpet of alarm for the future of our democracy. After all, there are deep disagreements in our society. And after a period in which one side of these deep disagreements had the bully pulpit, the other side now has it. And many of us have to extend our imagination to understand that, and I'll speak personally, what I received as optimistic common sense for 8 years was received very differently by a very substantial portion of the American population. And now, what many people in this room regard as odious is received very differently by nearly half the population. So we have to expand our imagination to see how all of this is being viewed, and I think that this falls within the zone of normal democratic politics. The variation between the two political parties is larger because of polarization than it has been, but that doesn't mean that a debate reflecting these policy polarities is necessarily a danger to our democratic system. The second reason that I don't at this point see our institutions in danger, although there are many dangers in our current course, is that, and here I'm going beyond the evidence, but I think not contradicting it. I think Americans deep down have not lost faith in their constitutional tradition. I do not believe that Americans, by and large, are willing to take a flyer on a very different form of governance. Even though if you take the Declaration of Independence literally, they're entitled to do so. But I think they're not inclined to do so. And that is significant. That is not true in a number of democracies in Western Europe, particularly the newer democracies. I see no reason to believe that the people of Hungary might not be willing to take a flyer on authoritarian nationalism with a few democratic trappings. But I don't think that's where we are in the United States. And here I think we can have an interesting discussion where we trade impressions as to just how close various people in the audience might believe we are to that point. So, if we're not there yet, how would we know if we had gotten there? And I've developed a number of tests. Let me just offer two as examples. Test number one: when the judiciary hands down a ruling that the president doesn't like, does the president obey the judgment of the court or violate it, disregard it? And in the past, of course, the highest court in the land has handed down judgments that made presidents very unhappy. Harry Truman got so concerned in the Korean War that he seized the steel mills. And the Supreme Court said, Mr. President, you can't do that. That is beyond the scope of your legitimate authority. And Truman grumbled, but he handed back the steel mills to private ownership. And somewhat nearer to our own time, Richard Nixon knew that his presidency was on the line with the release of the famous tapes. Nonetheless, when the Supreme Court ordered him to release the tapes, he did so. I can find in American history, but American historians perhaps can set me straight on this, no clear example of an American president who, when directly ordered to do something by the court, declined to do so. There is, of course, a famous episode during the administration of Andrew Jackson that people usually point to in this regard, where Jackson is said to have remarked, although he didn't actually. I hunted down some of the things that Jackson actually said, but he is reputed to have said, well, Mr. Marshall, that is, say, Chief Justice John Marshall, has made his decision, now let him enforce it. But it is not as though Marshall had ordered Jackson to do something, because the case actually involved a controversy at the level of the state of Georgia. And the question was, would the state of Georgia have to cease and desist or not? And what would happen if the state of Georgia did not? And Jackson took the position that he had no affirmative responsibility to enforce the judgment of the court. And he didn't. But he wasn't ordered to do so. And so I can find no example of a direct violation. And notably, right out of the box, this administration issued an executive order on immigration and refugees, which the federal judiciary said was unconstitutional. And I suppose the president could have flung down the gauntlet, but he didn't. He obeyed, withdrew the order, went back to the drawing board, and now order number 2 is wending its way through the judicial system. Here's test number 2. We are entering into dangerous territory for democracy if an administration fundamentally infringes on freedom of the press. That means going well beyond calling the press the enemies of the people, right? It means acting affirmatively to trammel press liberties. And that doesn't just mean restricting information. This is an old drama. The struggle between a press that demands maximum transparency from a White House and a White House that's determined to resist those requests is as old as the Republic. It means acting, for example, so as to impose prior restraint on what can and cannot be published, or punishing reporters, editors, and entire journalistic institutions that publish things that the President of the United States doesn't agree with. We haven't crossed either of those lines. In my judgment, we haven't crossed any of the red lines that I have defined for myself as signs that the fundamental institutional order is being challenged as opposed to long entrenched policies. So far, and this is my conclusion, the American constitutional order has survived all of the difficulties that I've spent the past half hour talking about. Nonetheless, events at home and abroad have been a salutary warning against progressivist complacency. History doesn't have an end, nor does it inevitably arc towards justice. There is no such thing as the wrong side of history to be on. For that reason, even though the past 3 generations have witnessed an unprecedented expansion of liberal democracy, which peaked in 2006, about a decade ago, liberal democracy isn't self-sustaining. It's a human achievement, not an historical inevitability. Like every human creation, it can be endangered by external attack, but also can be weakened from within when those who support it don't rally to its cause. That an event has never happened is no guarantee that it won't happen in the United States or anyplace else. Eternal vigilance is indeed the price of liberty. And liberal democracy will endure in the United States and elsewhere as long as citizens believe it's worth fighting for. Despite some troubling signs, most Americans, I believe, think it still is. Whether the same is true throughout Western Europe is a question that I will address tomorrow. Thank you very much for your patience.